Welcome everyone to this special edition of Get Your Game On, the channel dedicated to immersive gaming experiences. I couldn't be more thrilled than to start this new series where we're going to talk about sim racing studios, SRS, and their software, which is what drives the motion platform. We're going to go in deep about how we program our profiles, what all the settings do, and I couldn't have found a better guest than Jeff Weaver. Jeff is considered by almost everyone in the sim community as the universal expert on sim racing studios and tuning profiles. He's the go-to guy for a majority of the companies that need help with this stuff, and he's agreed to be my guest and walk us through all the intricacies of the SRS software. So, if you're interested in the SRS software and programming profiles, you came to the right place. Your masterclass is about to begin. All right, so here we are with the man, the myth, the legend, Jeff Weaver. Thank you so much for taking time and being willing to share your vast knowledge with some of my viewers. Really appreciate it. So for those of you that do know Jeff, he needs no introduction, but for some of you that are new, Jeff is basically the guru when it comes to motion and programming the SRS and all that stuff. And not only do I think that, but it's proven out because he recently was hired by SRS. So I'm right. I've got to be right because you recently got acquired by SRS because of your knowledge base. So do you want to talk a little bit about your new gig? And we actually planned this interview before you even got the gig. So This is all, we've had to push it back a few times because he's been so busy. So tell us a little bit about your new deal.
Yeah, well, I think gurus, I always looked at it as I was the one crazy enough just trying to figure it all out. And that's really how it just started. It literally started with just picking, I think it was 2 paragraphs that Sim Racing Studio had in their blog, and just building from there. And I think that's how it kind of evolved into the position. About 2 years ago, precisely March of 2020, is when I got my DOF Reality P3. And wanted to kind of learn how to tune it. So I just was trying to soak up as much information as I could. And because there wasn't a ton of it, I ended up being on the Sim Racing Studio Discord a lot, and talking to Gilbert and Marcelo there. They're the two that own Sim Racing Studio, and just would constantly ask them questions all the time. Not just basic ones, but details and how to do this and how to do that. What happens if I do that? And it was just really over that period of time that I got to know them, they got to know me, and that kind of friendship has been there ever since. So, whether it was before this position or not, I always would help them out. I would always try to figure out how to write the tutorials, and that was really just, again, helping the community. And I think it was just a natural evolution of just where I was. I had left Amazon. They knew I had left Amazon. I was looking to do something, really change in my career, to do something that I loved, rather than just, earning money and whatnot.
Right.
Wanted to do something that I was passionate about. So I've been looking for quite a while, and just taking time off, taking a rest period. And they knew that too. And it just kind of came together, with just the success that Sim Racing Studio has been having, a lot more people, as you have seen in the community, getting motion simulators. And the opportunity arose, and they gave me a call and offered me a position, and there you go. It's just perfect.
So what are your responsibilities? What are you doing over there?
So primarily managing customer service. So, it's a very small company. I call myself a director of customer experience. I like the title. They were like, what do you want to be called? I was like, director sounds cool.
Looks good on a future resume.
Exactly. And it kind of fits in my progression. Like, I was a senior program manager at Amazon in the device and digital space, primarily within customer service for the last 12 years. And what I did there was basically work with our product teams to introduce new products, whether it was an Alexa, Fire TV Cube, into the global customer service network. So I would work closely with them, figure out what customer contacts. I'd work with the teams, from operations to multimedia to the tech teams, working with pretty much vast teams of like probably 40 different ones globally. And helping getting those products into support, whether it was chat online or when you actually just call Amazon.
Okay.
So within Sim Racing Studio, I'm taking that experience and bringing it to them on the scale that they're at. Right. It's, it's really just us right now and a few other people that are helping, which are all awesome. But what I want to do is help them improve the customer experience by getting customer-facing knowledge up front. So tuning, of course, but basic troubleshooting, things like that.
I was going to say the tuning aspect. I'm sure that had a little bit to do with it. Wanted to be, So for those of you watching, the reason this is so perfect timing, I just finished the SFU upgrade, which means all of my profiles have to be readjusted because there's so much more motion in it. It just feels different. And so what better person than Jeff? And if you want to know more about Jeff's background, we're not going to do a lot of that today. Dave Daler did a great interview if you want to know all about Jeff and where he came from. But it's funny because your and my progression, or whatever you want to call it, is so similar. Like, I was watching your review and I'm sitting there going, yeah, Battlestar Galactica, yeah, launching all that. I was like, oh my, it's like we're brothers from another mother or something. Exactly. I mean, it's so funny. So that's the reason this is perfect timing, because I'm going through all my profiles now and having to change. I mean, I've read what I can and I've tried to learn it, but there's a lot to it. And again, nobody's gotten behind, pulled the curtain back like you have. So thank you again for coming and spending time here. So appreciate it. So let's just start off real simple. Let's,
Sure.
Why, playing devil's advocate here, why do I want to even spend time making tuning a profile? Because, when you get into something like Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 or Project Cars 2, not only do you have to program the profile for that game, it's every car or vehicle in that game. So you're talking a lot of time and dedication. What's the benefit? Why can't I just jump in that thing, turn it on, and play?
The main reason is, again, like you said, every car and every sim is a little bit different. The reason why every car and every sim is a little different is based off the physics engine for that particular game. So I think one of the first realities that hit me when I was first got my DO Reality P3 was, you just don't plug this motion simulator into a game and it works, right? Yeah. I think a lot of people think it's like a joystick, right? Yeah. They just plug it in and it works. And so it was like, okay, well, yeah, it supports Assetto Corsa, it supports Dirt Rally 2.0. But I, like many others, would get into it back in those days when we had really no motion profiles, and they were very, let's say, I wouldn't call them, I'll call them bad. They were just.
Let's go rudimentary. How's that?
Rudimentary. I like that term. Rudimentary and basic in how they were set up. But the motion just wasn't always matching. It was very jarring. It would throw you around. And though I think a lot of people go through that first moment where it's fun, like you're getting, because you've never experienced that before, it takes about 3-4 weeks until you're like, okay, I would actually like to be able to drive while I'm doing this, or maybe feel something. So I think the key there is looking at how every single car works, every single sim works, and tuning it to create an experience that's not just immersive, which is always one of my main goals.
Oh, yeah.
But also, can help you drive, that you can feel the traction loss start to occur through the shifting of the position on the yaw axis of the platform, that you can feel the weight distribution or the hits on the curb so that if you're hitting them too hard or if you're going a little too deep into the curb. Those were the things that I started focusing on. Is like, how do I bring that realism? So by jumping in and not tuning it, you're using an experience that is not going to give you the best possible experience that you can have. And by tuning it, you get that those fine movements. I like to always think of like tuning. I use analogies all the time. It's like cooking, right? You can go to a meal and you could just use one recipe, but that might not be, it's going to be bland after a while. But if you're able to spice it up and do different things with it, you'll be able to eat forever, right? Tuning to me is the same thing. I can create a cookbook, but I can't make everyone learn how to cook. So it's like the only way you get to cook is by doing it. And hopefully today I'll give everyone that direction as to this is the basics of how you start. These are the things that you should look out for. Like, don't mix like baking with something because it'll overpower it, those kind of things.
Well, and to continue with your analogy, that's one of the reasons you want to customize it, because everybody has different tastes. If you make a meal, not everybody at the table is going to enjoy your meal. So that's really, you're right on. The point of custom tuning is to spice your meal to fit your exact taste.
Exactly.
So that's exactly right. And yeah, and I realized that real quick, and it kills me. And I'm sure you've seen this too. I'll watch videos of guys that just got their sims or doing a sim, and you can tell they haven't touched the tuning. Yeah. Oh my goodness! It's like you're like, oh my goodness, what are you doing? Exactly. And you can see it as soon as you're watching it if you've spent any time with the simulator. So let me ask you. I've had a question that I've wanted to ask you for a while.
Sure.
So the enhanced G-force. There's a checkbox down there on the enhanced G-force. From what I can tell, you don't ever want to use that with a 6DOF, because to me, it looks like all it does is kill your axes and combine them into your standard axes. Is there a reason to use that if you have a 6DOF?
So enhanced G-forces. This would be one of those ones that I would classify as needs a lot of focus and work. What it does, and what enhanced G-forces does, is it will convert sway, which is the side-to-side movement, into roll, and it will convert surge, the forward and backward movement, into pitch. Right. And it leaves heave alone. So the translational types of movements, rather than rotational, it converts into roll and pitch. Now, the reason it does that is because and it's only inherent to a DOF platform, the HE6 and the P6, and because those can move on those particular axes. The question is always, why would I want to convert my 6 DOF rig into a 4 DOF rig when I paid extra for this? The issue becomes one of, how do you create that movement to be immersive? Right? So tuning a platform on a translational axis or tuning a platform on surge and sway is a lot more difficult than pitch and roll. The main reason is that when you move forward, it stops, and you don't feel anything else after you've moved it forward. Right. When you're pitching forward, it can remain pitched, so you get those what DOF or Sim Racing Studio will call enhanced G-forces. You're feeling the pitch forward of the brake. You're feeling the pitch backwards of acceleration. When the main issue with the DOF reality enhanced G-forces is you're not able to blend in pitch to that forward rotation, and you're not able to blend in roll into the sway. Right. So therefore, when those axes occur, it's very short, because there's not a lot of travel. So you might feel this, or you might feel that, or you might feel a gear shift. But what I found on that particular platform, because you can't mix in roll or pitch, you can't mix in that feeling of the car lifting up when you're first accelerating or first dipping down with braking. When I was tuning it, I found that it was more immersive to use enhanced G-forces than to only use the limited amount of sway and surge, because I wasn't able to mix in a little bit of pitch, and I wasn't able to mix in a little bit of roll.
So you always use the enhanced. That's where you that's where you tended?
That's where I tended to go, because I started exploring that in terms of how I would be able to mix in those different effects. And there isn't an ability right now to mix in pitch and roll, mainly because of some of the technical limitations within the platform. Now, that might be able to be changed later in firmware, which I would love. So if anyone's watching, yes, please, let's see if we can do that.
Igor, he's talking to you.
I'll work with you. I'll need an H6 for that, though. But that was the main thing. Now, when I talk about the most work in the very beginning of this, is I still feel that there is an opportunity to turn off enhanced G-forces and utilize that in a motion profile. A lot has changed within Sim Racing Studio since I've had it, mainly smoothing features, things like that, which are able to kind of balance those movements on those particular axes, because what would happen is they would become very jerky rather than just pitching forward or rolling. And so it became more of a question of, well, which one is better? What am I trying to shoot for? Am I trying to make profiles that use every aspect of a platform just to do it? Or am I trying to make immersive experiences? And I found from my testing from the tool set at that time,
right,
it was more immersive to have it go into pitch and roll because you still have heave.
Interesting.
Right? So,
see, and so I'm 180 from you. I'm like, I have not found that enhanced G-force. Like every time I do it, and I'm guilty. I'm the guy that turns the knobs until it feels right. But whenever I use that, it feels like I'm totally sacrificing my translational axes. So I don't really use it. So that's interesting that you tend to use it. So
well, I tended.
Let's say.
Yeah,
used to.
And that's where if there was one last thing before I sold my P6 was I was about to start really exploring how to utilize enhanced G-forces better. The one key thing is when I tuned for DO for reality, I was always kind of focused on making sure that the platform would work for everyone, whether you had an H3 or an M2 all the way to an H6 and P6. And so because I wanted to make sure everyone had an opportunity for the experience. And so what I found was that by using enhanced G-forces, it translated better into more platforms.
Okay.
But that's where I would say, and even in some of the posts in the DO for reality group, I was always like, I need someone to take up the mantle for enhanced G-forces because there's to me an untapped experience there. And since then, I would say that I think most people should turn it off and adjust it to where they need to go.
Okay.
If I were
I was ahead of the curve.
You are, exactly. Exactly. Because it is really about utilizing everything, right? And more importantly, we have the tools. There is still the opportunity to add pitch and roll into the surge and sway motion. But now it's with the smoothing effects. Before you would get thrown forward and would stop and throw you back.
Yeah.
And so it's very immersion breaking. The same thing with sway. But now there's an ability by increasing the sway smoothing, increasing the surge smoothing, that you can ease into those positions within that motion range so it can still remain immersive. It's really about that less is more aspect of it, but being able to tune it within the properties of the platform. So for you, like you check it off, and the first thing I would tell anyone is like increase the sway and surge motion smoothing up to like 40 or 50 and just see how it feels. Yeah. Because those particular axes, especially sway, isn't like what you would think of a very mellow curve as you go around a curve itself in terms of maintaining a large amount of G-force. What it'll do is most sims will come up and spike really hard when you first start the turn and then almost drop off immediately. So that spike is what will throw you to the side, and it doesn't, and it pulls you back because that spike is ended.
Okay.
The same thing with surge. When you're accelerating, there's generally a very first accelerate spike, but if you really think about it, it kind of lets up even when you're in your car. It's not always pushing you back, because in order for it to always push you back, you always have to be accelerating. So unless you're in a rocket, which is always increasing speed,
right?
It's similar in a car, but the way the telemetry works, it really does just spike and drop off at times.
Wow. Okay. Let's real quick, because we have people that are really new to this. Let's talk about the smoothing. Let's explain what we're talking about, because people are going, what are you talking about? So let's take a step back and talk about the smoothing and those aspects, so they can kind of understand where we're at and what we're referencing.
Exactly. So smoothing effects is basically applying and looking back over time. Well, let me first start with telemetry. So telemetry will be like the numbers that come in from the sim, whether they're positive or negative. If it's a positive, it can mean it's accelerating forward. If it's a negative value, it means you're braking. If it's positive value on, say, roll, it means you're rolling to the left. If it's a negative value on roll, it means you're rolling to the right. So it's always, again, telemetry is always a single number. It's either positive or negative.
And the telemetry is coming from the individual game software, whatever you're using.
This
is what the programmers of the game are outputting.
Exactly.
Okay, just so everybody understands, this isn't something SRS does. Telemetry is what the game sends out so SRS can read it.
Exactly. So telemetry, it's independent of platforms, and we'll get into max telemetries later. But what will happen is that telemetry will spike up, which is saying, okay, motion platform, I want you to start pitching forward because you're braking, and the telemetry is spiking forward. And then when it drops off, it tells the motion simulator, okay, you don't need to be braking anymore, so you can bring the platform back down. Well, the problem is if the telemetry spikes real fast and comes down real fast, the platform wants to do the same thing. It just will jerk all the way back and jerk all the way down, or whatever it's telling it to do. What smoothing does is it smooths that curve, so it's not quite as a peak, so it won't be as harsh of an experience jarring backwards and forwards if you're braking or accelerating.
Okay.
So you are manipulating the telemetry and taking it from what is originally there in terms of the original spike,
right,
but you're balancing it for a platform. So the way that smoothing works is the moment you start moving that slider, and it works in increments of 5, even though you can do it to 1, 2, 3, 4, it really just works in 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, and so on.
So if you're at 30 and you bump it to 31, you go, wow, that's a huge difference. It didn't do anything.
That's just in your mind.
Yeah, hey, that happens.
Hey, that's all that matters sometimes is what you think it feels like.
Yeah.
It's starting to look further and further back in time to average that particular telemetry value.
Okay.
So the more you look back, the more it's averaging the telemetry over time and softens that curve. So you can say go to 100. It's not going to say like take it down to 0, but it's going to look really far back, and therefore that curve might be just a bump, right? And what it can do is 2 things. One is when you have that spike, it can bring it back down. But the negative with smoothing is if you apply too much, then that little bump becomes a very, very tiny flat line, right? Or just almost nothing. And that's why I'm always like, be very careful with how much smoothing you apply, because you can tune out the small details because you're trying to focus on the large ones.
Well, and that's why I've always kept my smoothing very low because of that. And correct me if I'm wrong, I would say smoothing is more important on somebody that didn't program the telemetry very well versus if somebody really dials in I mean, I don't know what you think of DCS and their telemetry, but from my experience in it, it's pretty good. So something like DCS, you wouldn't necessarily need as much smoothing because the telemetry is good versus, say, Mark's car sim that I basically have a 1 and a 0 and that's it. You really want that smoothing.
Yeah, it's very dependent upon the accuracy of the telemetry coming from the sim, which is dependent upon the physics engine. You will find that some sims are better than others in terms of how they have the telemetry. The higher the values that they can go, the more headroom you have to work with. Okay. And the other thing as well is you can use it towards different types of platforms, right? And it depends on one, how fast the platform can move and how quickly the telemetry is being exported. So there can come a point where if you have a platform that can feel, that's updating very, very fast, you can feel those gaps in telemetry if they're, exporting in at like 30 hertz or 60 hertz or something like that, where it starts to feel a little jerky rather than smooth. When by adding the smoothing, it kind of blends that into, to the telemetry, so it doesn't feel as jerky as well. And there's also the occasions when you get to very high performance vehicles and sims, those spikes will be much higher. And that's when you start to utilize the smoothing for the platform to say, I need to work within what the platform has, because you always are still working within the realm of pure physics, right? Sure. If I move you to the left and move you to the right at the full range of, say, an H6, and I do that in 1/10 of a second, it's going to be very jarring, no matter what it is. And maybe it feels right in an F1, or maybe it feels right in a GT3, but I always try to remind people, too, it's like, but they're rebuilding their cars, like, after every race. Right. And you want to make sure your platform lasts a few years.
Your platform is physically moving, so you can beat it up, but it's not just a restart the game. If you abuse the platform, it's physically being abused. So
exactly,
that makes sense.
It is possible to put in settings that will start to break your rig because you just have it too jarring, right?
I'm always listening for that. Oh, what was that noise?
Yeah, what was that? Oh, yeah, I've had those experiences.
And that's what's bad when you're at VR and you're really immersed with the headset on, and all of a sudden, how did that happen?
Oh, yeah. And tuning things, I've had parts breaks before. So that's the other thing I love to do, and why I do it so passionately is is I want to get tunings out there that people can start with, rather than getting something that's so fundamentally broken it could potentially damage your rig.
Well, and so to wrap up kind of the smoothing, so you're saying, so for those of you out there, the SFU upgrade that we just did, much more movement on the surge, much more movement on the sway. That's what really I've noticed. So you're saying definitely crank the smoothing up to 30, 40 on those axes. The other axes, not so much, still play with them like you always have, or?
Yeah, so like this is and this is the biggest thing I always want to talk about in this interview, is that my guidance isn't the law, right, or the rule. This is
as close to it as we're going to get, though.
Yeah, but it's kind of like a cook, right? Like the analogy, It's like, don't all follow my recipe, because you might find a recipe that tastes a little bit better, right? You might find something that works a little bit better for your sim or your experience. But the way I generally look at it is like pitch and roll. I usually have it around 20 or so in different types of platforms, a lower value, because generally pitch and roll is very gradual. Because pitch and roll is the telemetry of the road, right? It's the hill that you go up. It's the bank of the corner. It's those types of effects. It does fit into the body roll of the vehicle as well. Yeah. So you will see a lot more pitch and roll on, say, an off-road vehicle than you will, say, in an F1 or GT3 car, because they just don't have that. So it's very dependent upon the roll of the car, but it's more dependent on the pitch and roll of that. So it's generally more gradual. So I don't like to use a lot of it, because I want to feel those slight changes in the road, which visually you see. Like the back straight of Donington has a little bump on it, and if I don't feel that bump, I'm like, okay, there's something wrong in this motion profile, right? Sure. Yaw, again, in our types of sims, is rarely utilized in racing, because yaw in racing represents the compass heading, so you don't really need it for that.
Unless you're driving very badly.
Exactly. But for motion sims, for flight sims, yaw is pretty important, because that will be the rudder, and because that has to do with the actual angle of deflection for the aircraft, and yaw can be pretty violent in flight sims. So I generally increase yaw smoothing in flight sims probably twice as much than, say, pitch and roll. So if I have pitch and roll at 20, it'll probably be 40 for yaw. When you get to sway, that is one of the main offenders of spikes, right? Sway is that G-force, or that effect that pushes you out of a corner when you're turning left and right. Generally, I like to have that as usually the most smoothing I'll put on, which will be between 40 and 50. You can lower it a little bit more than that depending on the sim as well. And what that will do is it'll still give you the effect of when you're coming in and out of a corner. But the best way to test it is by moving the wheel and warming up your tires. Right. Does it feel too jarring? Does it feel like it's pushing you around? Great. When you're going down a straight and you're about to pass someone quick, how does that feel? That's where sway is all about. And again, it can be very spiky when you do those quick movements. So adding a bit more smoothing there mellows it out, so it still feels immersive, but it isn't like throwing your sim all over the place, your simulator. Surge is the one that can vary depending on the programming of the developer, depending on what kind of racing you're doing. Pit limiters tend to have a huge effect on it, because they're spiking surge a lot, so you can add some smoothing there. But then you start to lose the fidelity of when you're feathering the throttle. Right. Braking generally will spike hard anyway, so you almost always will feel that. So where smoothing really starts to play for surge is how much acceleration do you want to feel? How much do you want to feel the snappiness of the throttle when you're kind of hitting it on and off? And with everything, there's always a balance. So if you use less smoothing for surge, you're going to feel more potentially braking jarringness or pit limiter jarringness or things like that. Okay. And then heave is the always elusive, as I like to say, hearing a whisper in a hurricane. Sure. Heave is what will give everyone, and what most people are always expecting from a motion simulator when they're thinking about bumps and when they're thinking about the road noise and those little tiny effects that come through when you're going down a straightaway. And it is the main difference between what people say is like, I feel like I'm in a boat, or I feel like I'm floating on glass, versus actually on a road. Heave is the one that I try to keep the absolute minimum for, where I usually try to keep it down to like 15 or 20, maybe a little bit higher depending on the sim. And that will be really determined by how much you're willing to deal with in terms of hitting the curbs. You
Sure.
know, if you're someone that likes to do aggressive through chicanes, be ready for a jarring time if you have your heave low.
Well, heave
Right?
is so again, and the flight sim stuff is where heave is huge because that's where you feel the runway. I mean, when you come down, that heave, I've got mine cranked down, I think now, and we'll talk about max memory, but I think my max memory on is like 3 or 4. It's really low, and smoothing's real low. But one of my favorite things when I'm racing is those bumps in the road. I love when you have that seam or you're coming off and transitioning asphalt concrete and you get that bump. It's like that is one of the most realistic feelings in the motion sim. It's a small thing, but it's really cool.
Yeah, and that's heave. Like heave is one of the ones that I would say I spend the most time on.
Yeah.
That heave is not so like smoothing is the increments of 5, but heave is the one that has the most impact with single digit changes. If you move the slider down, the slider for heave and the effects from 14 to 13, you'll feel the difference at times depending on how you have the max telemetry, and we'll get into that. But heave is variable. Like you said, for flight sims, you don't need a lot of smoothing. Why? Because you're not hitting the road all the time. You're in the air, right? And so, but if you get into a very high turbulent type of area, and it's extreme, and if anyone has ever played X-Plane 11 and gotten into the turbulent simulator and cranked it up to severe, you'll know what turbulence really can feel like in a motion rig. It is jarring, right? Yeah. So you want some smoothing there. But I generally try to keep it low because, like I said, I want to be able to feel those details, which is, again, the whisper. But I also need to balance it against the hurricane of when you're hitting the curb and you're going off-road. And I always try to tune for racing on the road versus I don't ever try to tune for crashes. If you tune for crashes, it'll feel too muted on the road, and then you don't have an incentive not to crash. So, you got to keep it.
You want there to be consequences.
Exactly. And then finally is traction loss. And traction loss can vary. That will be very dependent upon the car. I like to look at and how I'm learning the car and the feel of the car. So if the car is rather slippery, mainly rear wheel drive cars or front engine types of cars, I might add a little bit more smoothing because it tends to snap a little bit more. If it's something very tight, and I want to, in that a small slip can be detrimental, say like an F1 or something like that, I want to have a little bit less smoothing on traction loss because I want to feel that start to snap real quick, right? So smoothing for traction loss can range between 20 up to 40. And again, it will depend on the sim. I mean, there's very few sims that need to go above that, but they're out there. The new F122 telemetry isn't that great, so it gets cranked up a bit.
Rudimentary, is it?
Yeah, it's when you get to like the Simcade type of games, the telemetry can get really crazy, right? And so it's just a matter of just like really looking at what it is and feeling. But it's difficult sometimes when the values are just so whacked out. You're like, what is going on here?
Well, and that's where I find myself tuning because, again, this is immersive channel, so we're into flight, and I actually probably lean more into flight, and I know you tend to like the flight as well. So do these values kind of translate to also your flight settings, or is it a completely different ball of wax when you're dealing with tuning for flight?
I would say it is different. So let's go through that. So the difference between flight and say racing is the sim and roll. I like to have two different values for, like, say, or let me classify flight in almost three different pieces. Commercial civilian flight.
Okay.
That's going to be like a difference between like a 747 and a Cessna 172 will be a little bit different, whereas the 747 will be just a little bit more. I like to try to make it a little more heavier, so I don't want it as snappy, right? Then if you go into an acrobatic plane, you better crank that smoothing up because acrobatic planes just are insane how fast they can roll and do the different maneuvers and pitches and things like that.
So high smoothing on those. You want a lot of
smoothing on acrobatic planes because those are the ones that you could probably damage your your rig with, because the roll time, they will do sub-second full 360 rolls, right?
Okay.
And so your platform, it's just a real quick thing on, say, flight sims, because it really just applies to them with roll and pitch, is in a sim for flight, telemetry for a pitch and roll, and yaw as well, but mainly pitch and roll, goes from 0 to 180.
Okay.
And then it goes from 0 to negative 180.
Right.
And so, because it doesn't have a 360 value, because it's like, I don't know if you're rolling forward or, backwards, or are you, rolling left or right, or are you pitching forward or backwards? So that negative and positive number tells them that. Well, the problem is that a motion platform can't rotate 360. Right. So what will happen is, as you start to say, let's say you're doing a barrel roll and you're going and you start turning to the right, and it goes to 45, 90, all the way to 180. Now it needs to quickly switch over to negative 180 to go this way, but it can't cross over that way. The value needs to suddenly jump all the way back over, which makes your rig come back over to that negative 180 and then come back into center. So what will happen in most, say, let's call it non-acrobatic or non-high-performance jet fighter planes, is it will hit that value and slowly move back over to there, and you kind of feel it. Smoothing helps with that.
Okay.
But when it's a spike like that, and I say a DOF reality platform, you want to have more smoothing, because that can happen every second, right? Less than a second. And it starts to feel incredibly jarring when you're doing that.
So what kind of number value are you talking about when you're talking about the value?
50, 60.
Wow.
I think in one of my tunings I go to 80 on.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, because it's really, again, that's to be dependent on the plane.
Sure.
And but an acrobatic plane can usually roll a lot faster than, say, sometimes an F-16, right? And it depends on what that speed is going to be, of how much smoothing I'm going to apply to it. That's when it really starts to get more into the question of making it feel playable on your platform than trying to emulate the speed of the roll of an acrobatic plane, because you can't be pulling, like, say, 6 Gs in your platform when it needs to roll back and forth all the time. You can try, and I've been up to 2 to 3 Gs before, and that's not fun.
Well, yeah.
In platform, but yeah, it's crazy.
So it's interesting, because I shot that video where I did the roller coaster sim, because it was the best way I could test the difference. And so I was noticing that swing big time. You're doing corkscrews, and I really noticed that. So if I add more smoothing, crank that up. I mean, my smoothing, I generally never even go over 40. So I'm going to have to really dial in the smoothing. So if I crank that up, that should give that.
That'll balance it out. Some other types of platforms have what they call spike filters, which look for that. And that'd be another thing that to see if one day DOF Reality can start to build into their firmware, which is it calculates how fast the platform is going to move, in a certain period of time, and can apply a throttling speed to it so it doesn't become very jarring. For DOF Reality platforms, that's where the effects smoothing comes in, or smoothing effects comes into play, because it starts to balance that. But just to jump real quick, is that's also an ability of overall smoothing. And so that's the third one down, or the second one down, I believe.
I'll put a screenshot on here.
Perfect. And what overall smoothing does is it says, okay, you're going to rotate from, say, the left to the right and back to the left in a very fast time. What we'll do instead is, if you say setting overall smoothing to 50, what will happen is it'll move all the way to the right and only 50% of the way back to the left. Okay. Right? If you have it at 90, it'll move all the way to the right and only 10% back to the left. So that slider of overall smoothing, and it only applies to extremely fast telemetry changes, and I don't have the time, but I know it's within under a second type of feel, and you can really do it if you use the joystick emulator. Mm-hmm. But it's a way to kind of compensate for those fast movements that are going back and forth. Generally, I like to use or would keep overall smoothing, I think, around 50 or 70, depends on the sim, wow. Maybe a little bit less. Because again, you don't really feel those jarring motions unless there's a really, really fast piece, and or a fast change in telemetry, and it was a way to kind of, again, mitigate those extremely jarring experiences, because it doesn't fire all the time. It's not going all the time if you're just normally flying or normally driving, but it'll be like when you crash. Or if you eject out of an airplane and it's throwing you all around.
Or you get a wing blown off in a World War II. That's where I've had the most.
Exactly. And you're just going down. It's a way to limit that insane movement. It's still going to feel going, but it's not going to be just throwing you around all the time.
So the overall smoothing, the stuff we talked about before, is individual axes. But this overall smoothing is more almost a safety net, would you say?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's a safety net to limit the amount of extreme movement from one direction back to the other one, so that you are not being thrown around too crazy.
And this one won't necessarily mute the small, finer details then, like the other ones?
No, it's only for when those fast motions occur. So you can have it cranked up pretty high, but it's not going to start affecting like the small details. Again, I'll see if I can get more guidance in terms of like the actual timing frame. I know it's well under a second, so it's. I mean, you can experiment with it and crank it to 100, crank it to 50, and see what the difference is. But you're really not going to feel that unless you're doing those extremely fast movements. Like I said, it limits the amount of return. So it really just depends on how fast those jarring motions are going from an extreme. And it's not, again, like these types of small motions. It's a very extreme types of motions.
So that alone was worth this call, because I've always kept that overall smoothing down because I didn't want to mute. I'm like, okay, we're just compounding the smoothing, and I was really worried about taking out that subtlety. And so if that's more of a safety net and I don't have to worry about that, that gives me a lot more willingness to play with that overall smoothing slider. So thank you. See, it's an educational stream. It's an educational segment. We're learning together.
That's what it's all about.
So I've got a lot of work to do on my smoothing, because my smoothings are all real low, because I didn't want to lose the fidelity. So that may help with some of the issues that I've run into with the SFU. And we're getting a weird rebounding effect that I can't quite figure out, where it overshoots it and then you can feel it kick back. It's almost like bottoming out a car in a rut, where it just all of a sudden it's just a real jarring, and it's not a heave thing. It's something with a rebound with those motors. And I filmed it and I can't quite figure out what's going on. So maybe that smoothing might be something to do.
Yeah, I would. I'll have an H3 soon, so I'll be able to with the SFU, so I'll be able to start testing that. And my plan is as well as to update all my profiles. I'll probably actually just be creating new profiles that'll be like SFU version. Yeah. And I'm thinking of what would be causing that smoothing. That's where I would start playing with the. One of the best tips I can give when you're trying to troubleshoot a particular axis or motion that you have no idea what it is go into Sim Racing Studio. On the far right of all these sliders is an on-off button. Yeah. Turn off all the different axes, but leave one of them on, and say leave pitch on, and play for a second. Do you feel that motion? No. Turn off pitch, go to roll. And I have done that so many times to isolate a particular axis that I'm like, where is this motion coming from? Right. And then even then, it sometimes could depend on what you're doing. What was a recent one that I discovered is if you have the engine haptic effect on really high, I would say like 4 or 5, and you're in like, say, a Cessna 172, and you're doing a very slow turn, well, that engine haptic effect is like shaking the rig, right? So if you're doing a turn, it's not going to be smoothing, because now it's trying to smooth. It's kind of giving that effect on the smoothness of that particular pitch or roll, and it could be like, well, why is that occurring? It's like because the engine haptic effect might be too strong for that particular aircraft. So like what I learned was like for say propeller type aircraft, I generally will use a shaker kit rather for my engine RPM than say engine haptics, so that you just maintain that smoothness in the roll. Whereas for racing, you'll never feel it because it's like road telemetry.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So I guess let's wrap up the smoothing. Is there anything else we need to know? I mean, any other final thoughts on smoothing before we move on?
I would just say, remember, set it the smoothing effects at the bottom. Do it in increments of 5. don't be afraid to crank it up if things, start to feel a little too jarring. Try to keep it low for heave. Too much smoothing effects on heave will drown out everything. Overall smoothing is, again, really more just like a software version of a spike filter in terms of limiting the jarring motion. So you don't have to be too afraid of it. But again, if you're in F1 and the telemetry is very fast and you're moving from left to right, you might want to feel those. So you don't be afraid as well to crank overall smoothing down very low or set it to 0 and see how it feels for your particular type of racing. But if you're doing aerobatic type of flights, or you're in a combat flight sim, or you're doing off-road racing, you might want to have some more overall smoothing. So I think that's the best way I can put it. Smoothing should be really looked at as a way to kind of calm telemetry down. But I also have a philosophy. I try to use as little smoothing as possible because I always want to have the raw telemetry, what's coming from the car. But you also have to remember it's a platform and you don't want to break it.
See, I think I was a disciple of yours. I think you saw that, I saw that in one of your interviews or I read it or something, and I saw keep the telemetry, the smoothing down as much as you can. So I'm like down in 10, 15. So I went too far. I need to bring it back a little bit.
It depends. Yeah, if you're feeling any kind of jarring motion, one of the first things I'll start to say is like reduce or increase effect smoothing before we get to the sliders and max telemetry, but we can get to that soon.
Yeah, let's go to the counter of smoothing, which is boost. And explain boost, and is there ever are they mutually exclusive? Where does boost play into this whole tuning aspect?
Boost is primarily looks at very small telemetry values and will increase them by like the multiplier that you start to raise that slider up.
Okay.
What that was originally used for was, say, for the non-SFU DOF reality platforms, the fidelity of being able to feel the road bumps at times wasn't always there because the motors and the sensors wouldn't be able to respond quickly enough to those particular different changes. So what Boost is able to do is look at those small telemetry values, say of heave, and boost them up enough to where they're exaggerated to where you can feel more bumps in the road. I would say it was primarily for heave. The negative of boost is it applies to all telemetry.
Right.
So it's going to start boosting pitch and roll and all these different things. Now with the SFU gears, you're going to feel those different things, right? So generally I would say my rule is if your platform has the fidelity for it, turn boost down to 1, right? Because 1 is just a multiplier. It's just multiplying it by 1. Once you go up above 1, it's multiplying at like 0.1 or 0.21, well, 1.1, 1.21 exact, as you keep going up that slider. So because, again, I'm a proponent of pure telemetry, I don't want to be modifying or multiplying the telemetry now to make it more jarring in events that don't need to be jarring. So generally I would say is that, and this is where I don't know the values yet until I get my SFU, but I would say from what I've heard is that for SFU, you probably want to turn boost down because it might make certain experiences too jarring. And when I say down, I say between 35 all the way down to 1. If you are using a regular DOF gears, I would say leave it at 30, 35. The highest I think I ever go is 40, because what can happen is once you get above 40, 45, there's always telemetry going in a simulator. It could be the engine RPM or whatnot. And all of a sudden you boost that little shake, and that shake gets bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden you're sitting there going like, why is my rig just shaking and freaking out? Right. And it's because you have your boost set to like 70, right? So my rule of thumb is like I barely ever went over 40 or 45. 50 was a big no-no for me in terms of boost.
And just for those watching, the scale is 100. I mean, that's...
Yeah, exactly.
That's the range when I throw these numbers out. 100 is... Do you know, what is boost the 100? What's that a multiplier of? I mean, I think
it's like a double, like 2x then.
Double.
It has to be, because it's like, I know what the telemetry value is coming out, and it might even be more than that. I'll have to check. Some of that stuff is proprietary to software. So like
Sure.
that's when like you get the difference between Sim Racing Studio and other software. So some of that is within the formula. But let's just say I've never been brave enough to go to 100 boost.
Right.
So if someone
So
does,
boost.
good luck.
So keep boost way down. So I could see where boost would have been something. So in IL2, I could never get the runway, the heave on the runway. Never. Now I did exactly what you said. I turned the axis down and I played with it to see if there was anything even there, and there was, but it was so minute. So what I probably needed to do was, that's a situation I did need to bump the boost and then offset that with the individual smoothing sliders, right?
Exactly, because that's where you can kind of start to balance those particular pieces out. But as I always say, if you're starting to balance and starting increasing smoothing, it's always a question too of like how I go back to that hearing a whisper in a hurricane.
Yeah.
Like if those values are very small and you're trying to get those to work, and let's say pitch, right? And I want to get feeling of more pitch and fidelity when I'm in a civilian flight sim flying a Cessna 172, and I really want to feel those small movements of the plane, in single digit degrees. You can start to tune the platform for that, right? That you can get to feel those little tiny degrees of movements. The problem is the moment you start to do something extreme, it's going to feel really jarring because it's like you're listening and you turn up the volume and all of a sudden someone yells and you're like, whoa, okay, that's the same thing. So boost is one of those ones where you're turning up the volume to hear those lower things, but you're going to make, say, like if you do it on IL2 on the runway, you're going to feel those runways. But when you have a hard landing, man, that's going to feel like a hard landing. So it's always a balance of what you want to do. And then sometimes you will find that certain runways have better telemetry and are rougher than other ones. So it's always is a balance.
Sure.
But that's what I look at as boost is when you're looking for details that aren't there, you can start to turn it up. But I would really focus on other areas before I would go to boost because it impacts all the axes.
That's the IL2 is the only one that I can think of that I could even see where that's needed. Like I've been able to get the fidelity close to where I've wanted in almost everything I've tried, but IL2 I have not been able to get that landing, that runway feel yet. So I'll play with it. Now, are boost and smoothing, the overall smoothing, are those counter to each other, or is there a reason you'd ever have a lot of both? How do those interact with each other?
They go within the formula before it's like I believe they're applied to the telemetry before they actually go into the formula itself in terms of what the total motion is going to be at the very end. They are exclusive of each other. So, I mean, you can have a lot of boost and a lot of overall smoothing, but remember that boost is small telemetry values that are being boosted up. Overall smoothing are really large telemetry quick changes that are like limited in terms of their return from from this way. So they are fundamentally different. They're on different sides, but they do a little bit different in terms of how they're manipulating the telemetry.
So realistically, they're not. I mean, they're really not. They're opposite, like you said, opposite sides of it. So you really could use them both.
Oh yeah.
Use the right tool, right? You just
exactly.
And that's why I appreciate you're making us understand the tools. I mean, so I never understood that. I thought you were basically canceling yourself out. The more you added one, you were basically reducing the other one. So the fact that they're different, and that makes sense the way you explained it. So fine detail boost will boost any fine detail. Smoothing, overall smoothing, not the individual, but the overall smoothing is to level out the spikes and the extreme movement.
Yeah, the return. Okay. I like to really be clear in the terms of like the difference between overall smoothing and effect smoothing.
Yeah.
Or smoothing effect, sorry. Overall smoothing is the one that will limit the return of the platform. So if it goes left and right and you set it to 50, it'll only come back 50%, right? If you have overall smoothing set to 10 and it goes from left to right real fast, it'll go from left to right only a little bit, right? Or all the way, so it depends on, it's like a limiter in terms of the next telemetry movement on that axis to keep it from being extremely jarring. Whereas effect smoothing or smoothing effects is averaging the telemetry over time, right? Yeah. So it's going to smooth and flatten out the curve. It's going to manipulate the telemetry in a smoothing curve, where overall smoothing is only for those very fast jarring events. It won't impact the regular telemetry. And how it does it is it doesn't average anything. It just limits the return of the platform.
And just to be clear, the higher the number, the more it limits movement.
Exactly.
Just to be clear, so everybody understands, the more you crank that up, the more limited movement you'll have.
Exactly.
Okay.
In those extreme spiky events. So you can have it cranked up and you can be playing a lot and never feel it, but when you go crash and it's spiking like crazy, that's when it comes into play.
I got to go, Jeff. I got to go play with no. God, we're not even close yet. But man, you got my brain just crooked. I mean, I'm like, oh, there's so much. Okay, that profile I need to adjust that profile I need to do this. Your sickness is contagious, Jeff.
But this is great. This is great for me too, because now that I'm with Sim Racing Studio, we can start to look at the user interface and start to go like, okay, the user interface as well has been built up over time. There was a time that all there was overall smoothing. There was no smoothing effects. Okay. So maybe that is a thing that needs to be rebranded in some way, so it's a little bit more clear to the user. Right. Same thing with Boost in terms of like what is Boost doing. So this is educational for me as well, and part of one of the things I'm passionate about is making Sim Racing Studio and helping them create the best user experience. So this is great. I love it.
Well, and it's already one of the best user experience. So, but we're not ones to sit on our laurels, rest on our laurels. We got to keep raising that bar. So one thing you don't know, Jeff, is back when I kind of had the same progression you did, going through looking at the next level, like the seat mover and all that, and then when I found the DOF reality, your video was one of the first ones I saw on it. It was the one where you went through all your customizations and showed all the stuff, and I was like, okay, this is it. I can get this thing, and it's not like, okay, you've got it, that's it. I can customize this thing. I can do what I want. So I fell in love with that thing, and it's your fault. You're the reason I spent all this money.
Awesome. I mean, that's a big reason why I started the channel. It was never, and it still isn't. It's never a thing of where I'm like, oh, I want to be YouTube and have a channel. It was more like, let me get a channel up to show people that are looking for the information I was looking for.
Yeah.
Right? Because there wasn't really a lot of videos. There was maybe 2, and they were very single angle, and I couldn't really see what they were doing. Yeah. And my thing was like, for those that are trying to make the same decision, it was, here's what the platform looks like if you're playing Dirt Rally or playing this sim. And you'll see some of my very early photos were, like one of my very first videos was like DCS, because I've always been a flight guy. Sim guy, DCS and Elite Dangerous, and IL2 is awesome, one of my favorites. And it was, I couldn't find a single video of people doing flight sim stuff, right? Yeah. And even helicopter stuff is like, barely
still don't see much helicopter stuff.
So it was like, let me do a video just to show people what that would look like. And that's how that started. And it's been useful in the sense of like, this is what the motion looks like in Assetto Corsa, or this is what it looks like in iRacing. So if someone is also getting a platform and it doesn't feel right, I'm like, does it look the same as mine? Right. And like, no, it's like, okay, try this profile. So it's great that I can help, with everyone's, addiction into the deep dark hole that is immersion.
Well, I mean, again, this channel is based on immersion, but what really struck me on your stuff, your presentation, and you can tell you almost have instant credibility just because of your demeanor. It's like so many of those other videos were kind of, like, okay, I mean, he might believe that, but I don't know that I believe him. And you had so much credibility in the way you presented. It was almost like listening to an engineer present some. It's like it made sense. I mean, that it spoke to me at least, and I was like, okay, because at the time when I was looking at one, there was still a lot of those DOF are cheap, and they're not. There was a lot of that, and so it's really like, oh man, do I really want to invest in this DOF? I mean, some people say it's great, some people not. And when I got to see what you had done, and you showed close-ups of the framework and everything, I was like, okay. Maybe their early stuff was rough, but the new stuff is pretty good. And I can tell anybody that's thinking about it, the new rigs, I mean, they're not perfect, but man, it was better than I expected it to be. When I got it, I was like, man, this thing is good. I mean,
and that's what I'm excited. I mean, I got my first box of the H Streets with the SFU gears. I was looking at them. I saw the videos, your videos and everything. And they are basically actuators. I mean,
Yeah.
they're just a different type of functioning actuator, and it allows that ability to have the smooth motion, and to have a different range from not just flight sims, but if you're doing racing and different things for that. So my take on it as well, whether it's DOF Reality, or PT Actuator, or SFX 100, or Sim Racing Studio, or the other programs like SimTools or Fly PT Mover or whatever it will be. My thing is, like, I always want the sim community, the sim motion community, to grow. It helps everyone. Of course, I will have my bias with Sim Racing Studio, but for platforms as well, it's like there's a large range, and I never want to be someone that's like, go here or go there,
right?
Because telling someone to spend $15,000 on a motion simulator, it's like crazy, right?
Especially if like you said when you were talking before, it's like I think when you talked to Dave, you said you don't want to spend that. You might not even like it.
You might not.
You don't want to try. And that was my biggest hang up. As much as I knew in my heart, I'm like, I'm going to love this. This ticks all the boxes for me. I didn't want to dump. I mean, I think we spent about $5,000 anyways, for the H6, by the time everything was said and done. But 15, 20,000, it's like, and then if you don't like it,
Exactly. Now, but then in one day, if you get to that point where you're like, okay, this is my hobby, right? This is what I love, and I'm going to do it forever. Then that price doesn't seem as crazy.
Well,
for comparing it to, say, like a Harley Davidson.
Well, and you and I come from racing. I mean, I had my own race car. I built my own race car. This is a drop in the bucket compared to not only building a race car, but just running a race car from week to week. So yeah, if you start comparing it to that, and then let's not even talk about an airplane. I mean, I can't even buy an F-18 if I wanted to, yet I could take it up for a flight whenever I want. So everything's relative,
Yep, and a lot of those hobbies, the cheapest part is just buying the thing in the first place. It's like the trailering it, the gas, if you're doing competitions or whatever, it's like the entry fees, the hotel rooms. So to me, it's like, this is cheaper than my last hobby. Even though it's expensive, it's the thing of, it hits all the marks for me. And I think that's what came through in that video of me showing my modifications was, I really do look at these rigs as like our weekend race cars, right?
Yeah.
You can customize it. Everyone has their different flavor of what they like to do, different colors, different accessories. There's the people that are looking like, how do I squeeze out the last bit of performance out of it? There's those that are like, I don't care about that. I want it to look cool. I want both. So it's just applying that same kind of philosophy that I had when I was showing the video, which is like, here are all the modifications I've done. Because we're part of the DOF builders. There was like 300 of us in the beginning that they were put together when I first joined. And it was all like, how do we tweak things? How do we share this? And, from there.
And I got to say, one of my favorite things about the DOF, and I'm not a DOF fanboy. Well, I am, but I like it because I like what it does. I don't like it because of the label on it. I'm a guy that if it works, great. But my favorite thing about the DOF, you don't have Igor back there going, oh, no, you added this, that, I'm not going to help you if you break that. I mean, he's kind of a hot rodder too. It's like he doesn't care if we sit there and tweak these things and customize them. He's still going to support us. And that's one of my favorite things about DOF Realities is that, you can mess with it, you can do it, and you don't have to worry about something going wrong and Igor going, you're out, forget it, go. So that is one of my favorite things. So we've been going an hour, and so what I want to do is, I think this is a good breaking point. We're going to do multiple parts of this because I'm not letting Jeff leave yet. You're sticking around. So this is going to wrap up part one where we kind of talked about, the smoothing and got a lot of good information. And so in part two, we're going to release that later. And part two, we're going to start talking about Jeff's process for how he goes through setting up a tuning and some of that stuff. And then we're also going to talk to him a little bit about the difference in the rigs now that he's had the DOF and now he's got an actuator based. I want to get a little more detail of what his thoughts are on that. So we're going to wrap this up here for part one, but stay tuned for part two. And if you don't want to miss anything, like and subscribe as always. So you'll see part two when it comes out. But Jeff, stick around. We'll carry into part two. And so far, I hope you guys are enjoying it. Great information here. So thank you for watching.